The wagon creaked as it rolled to a stop in front of the ranch house. Clara sat stiffly on the bench seat beside the driver, her hands folded tight in her lap, fingers raw from the cold morning wind. Her dark hair was tied back with a frayed ribbon, but stray strands clung to her cheeks. She dared not look up at the house just yet. The driver jumped down first, tossing her small cloth bag to the dirt. Clara followed, stepping carefully, her boots sinking into the dry, pale dust. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might echo off the wooden porch. The door above them stood open, a dark square swallowing the inside. A single figure leaned in the doorway, a tall man with a broad hat and stiff shoulders. He didn't move as they approached. The driver muttered something she didn't catch, lifted his hat in a quick gesture, and turned back to the wagon without waiting. The horses jerked forward, leaving a thin trail of dust hanging in the heat. Clara stayed where she was, clutching her elbows. The man's eyes felt heavy on her, even though she couldn't see them clearly under the brim. "Clara," he finally said. His voice was low and flat, like a door closing slowly. Inside, she hesitated, shifting her weight. The porch steps looked impossibly high, the shadows behind the man too deep. She swallowed hard and forced her feet forward. Each step creaked under her weight, and when she reached the top, she paused, feeling the heat of his presence close, almost choking. He didn't move to help her or take her bag. Instead, he turned abruptly and walked inside. She followed, her breath quickening as the doorway swallowed her in darkness. The stale, dry smell of the house pressed on her. There were no sounds except the floorboards sighing beneath her boots. The man stopped in the hallway, turning only his head. "Leave your things there," he said, nodding to a corner. Clara obeyed, setting her bundle down as if it might shatter. He waited, eyes still on her. When she straightened up, she caught a glimpse of old wallpaper peeling and the edge of a cracked mirror down the hall, reflecting the narrow, suffocating space. "You'll follow my rules here," he continued. "No wandering, no speaking unless spoken to. You eat when I say, you work when I say, you sleep when I say." His words cut through the air like a knife against bone. Clara's lips trembled, but she didn't dare open her mouth. She nodded once, sharply. The man's gaze lingered on her face a moment longer. Then he turned and walked deeper into the hallway. Clara stood frozen, the echo of his boots growing fainter. She pressed her back against the wall, her eyes darting around the dim corridor. A thin line of sunlight from the door behind her barely reached her feet. Her mother's funeral felt like a distant fog now. She had thought she was coming here for shelter. Instead, each breath already felt like a quiet plea for mercy. She stared at the door, her heart screaming for her to run. But her feet stayed planted, and the door closed behind her with a hollow, final click. Clara didn't sleep that night. She lay on the narrow cot in the small back room, staring at the cracked ceiling as the walls pressed in around her. Every small creak in the house felt like a sharp breath against her ear. At dawn, heavy boots thudded down the hallway. She sat up quickly, her heart hammering. The door swung open without a knock, and the man stood there, hat still on, a gray line of morning light outlining his frame. "Up!" he said. Clara scrambled to her feet. Her legs were stiff and unsteady, but she managed to stand straight, gripping the edge of the cot to keep from shaking. He stepped aside, motioning her into the hallway. She obeyed, eyes cast down. The wallpaper felt closer today, the air thick with dust and something sour she couldn't name. At the end of the hall, a narrow kitchen waited. The table was bare except for a chipped tin cup and a half loaf of dry bread. He pointed at the chair without speaking. Clara sat, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "You eat when I tell you," he said slowly, each word cold and heavy. "You work when I tell you. You don't speak unless I ask you a question. Understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. He set the bread in front of her and filled the cup from a metal jug. The water smelled of iron. Clara forced herself to swallow small pieces, each bite turning into a stone in her mouth. When she finished, he took the plate without a word and moved to the sink. The only sound was the harsh scrape of the tin against the cracked enamel. She kept her eyes fixed on the table, feeling her pulse in her temples. After a moment he turned to face her again. "Outside chores today," he said. "No wandering past the gate, no talking to the hand. You stay where I can see you." Clara nodded again, rising slowly. Her palms were slick with sweat despite the cool morning air. He moved toward the back door, opening it wide. The pale sun glared against the dry yard, making her squint. She stepped outside, feeling the ground shift beneath her boots. A lone chicken scratched near the fence, and a pile of firewood sat against the wall. Beyond that, the land stretched flat and endless, cut by a pale trail that disappeared into the horizon. The man stayed in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes locked on her every move. She bent to pick up a log, her fingers trembling. Every motion felt watched, judged, measured. Even the wind seemed to hush itself around her. Clara kept her head low, moving log after log into a pile by the shed, each piece heavy and rough. Behind her, she felt his stare like a rope around her neck. Each breath came sharp and shallow. The rules were clear now, etched into her bones. There was no kindness in this place, only obedience and silence. She paused once, wiping sweat from her brow, and dared a single glance toward the gate. Just a glance, but enough to feel a flicker of something dangerous and warm inside her. A memory of her mother's voice whispered faintly in her ear. She swallowed it down, turned back to the logs, and kept her hands moving. By midday, the sun burned high over the yard, turning the dust into a thin haze that clung to Clara's skin and throat. She worked without pause, stacking logs, sweeping the porch, fetching water from the pump. Her fingers were raw and nicked from splinters. Her back ached in a dull, punishing rhythm. She felt him watching from the doorway, his figure barely moving, only shifting to follow her with cold, unblinking eyes. When he finally stepped back inside, Clara allowed herself a single shaky breath. But she didn't stop. She knew he could return at any moment. It was then she noticed the maid, a woman standing half-hidden near the barn wall, her gray dress blending into the wooden boards. Clara had not seen her before. The woman's head was bent, dark hair pulled tight in a knot. She carried a small bucket, moving with careful, almost invisible steps. Clara slowed her sweeping, eyes flicking cautiously to the side. The maid lifted her gaze just once, their eyes meeting for a fleeting second. There was no greeting, no hint of warmth, only a quick, silent warning in the woman's eyes before she turned away again. Farther off, a thin, bent ranch hand shuffled past with a feed sack over his shoulder. His clothes hung off his bony frame, and he kept his head down, moving as though he might vanish into the dust at any moment. Clara watched him disappear behind the barn, each step hesitant and slow. She realized then that no one spoke here. The silence was not just a rule, it was the air itself, heavy and inescapable. A sudden cough echoed from inside the house, snapping her back to her broom. She dragged it across the boards, trying to steady her breath. The maid reappeared a few moments later, walking toward the house with her bucket. As she passed Clara, her eyes dropped again. Close up, Clara saw lines around her mouth, small scars on her wrists. Their shoulders nearly touched, but neither dared pause. Clara's heart hammered in her throat. She longed to ask, "Who are you? How long have you been here? Can we leave?" But her tongue felt nailed to the roof of her mouth. The woman disappeared inside, and the sound of the door latch sliding home felt like a blade against Clara's spine. She pressed her forehead to the broom handle, her breathing ragged. The sun crawled higher, burning her neck, her shoulders, the tops of her hands. Beyond the barn, she thought she saw the outline of a small window, a faint curtain stirring. Another secret watcher? Or just a trick of the heat? Clara shook her head quickly, forcing her focus back to the yard. She had to keep moving, keep obeying. But under the dust, under the orders, a small ember smoldered in her chest. It flickered in the silence, too weak to call hope yet, but alive all the same. That night, Clara lay awake again, her muscles screaming with every small shift on the hard cot. The air in the room felt thick, sour with sweat and dust. From time to time, she thought she heard footsteps outside her door. A soft shuffle, then silence. She held her breath each time, counting the seconds until the sound faded. When she finally drifted into a shallow, broken sleep, the images that came were feverish. Her mother's voice calling from somewhere she couldn't see, a door creaking open, hands reaching through the dark. At dawn, the man's voice snapped her awake. "Up!" She swung her legs down, wincing as her bare feet touched the cold floorboards. He stood in the doorway again, hat still on, as if he never took it off. His eyes scanned her quickly, then flicked away. "Kitchen, now." Clara followed him down the narrow hallway. The wallpaper looked more torn today, the edges curled like dry leaves. She kept her head low, her breath shallow. In the kitchen, the same tin cup and stale bread waited. The man stood by the sink, arms crossed. She sat without waiting for instruction, picking at the hard crust with trembling fingers. While she chewed, she heard something. A faint scratching above her head, as if something moved in the ceiling or the attic. She froze, her teeth clamped on a piece of bread. The man didn't react, staring at the window, lost in some private calculation. When she finally swallowed, she forced herself to keep eating, pretending not to hear. But inside, her thoughts roared. What was up there? Another person? An animal? The man turned suddenly. "After you're done, clean the hallway floor," he said. "No missing spots. I'll check." She nodded. He watched her finish the last piece of bread, then walked out, heavy boots echoing. The moment he was gone, Clara pressed her hands flat against the table, trying to steady herself. When she finished, she filled a small tin pail from the pump and knelt in the hallway. The water sloshed onto her skirt, but she didn't dare complain. As she scrubbed, she noticed details she hadn't before. Long scratches in the wood near the baseboards, like claw marks. A dark stain under one of the old rugs. A nail jutting out from the wall at shoulder height, with a faint scrap of cloth still clinging to it. Her breath hitched. She forced her hand to keep moving in slow circles, though her mind reeled. Every inch of this house whispered secrets, sharp, dangerous ones. At one point, she looked up and saw the cracked mirror at the far end of the hallway. In it, she caught her own reflection. A thin, pale girl kneeling on the floor like a servant, eyes wide and haunted. She didn't recognize herself. A sudden creak above made her jolt. This time she was sure. Footsteps in the attic. She pressed her palm over her mouth, fighting to stay silent. The water in the pail rippled as her hands shook. She stayed frozen there, her knees burning against the boards, her ears straining for every sound. Then, as quickly as it started, the noise stopped. Clara let out a slow, trembling exhale. She dipped her rag again, dragging it across the wood with numb hands. Every corner, every inch, watched. Even when empty, the house felt alive, breathing around her. When she finished, she wrung the rag tight, the water running red from her scraped knuckles. She looked down at the floor, shining and clean, and felt a tight knot coil deeper in her chest. She knew now this was not just a house, it was a cage, and she was far from the first to kneel here. The day dragged on beneath a sky so pale it looked bleached. Clara moved through her chores like a ghost, her mind snagged on the noises from the attic, on the scratches in the floor, on that nail with its scrap of cloth. By late afternoon, the man ordered her to fetch water from the far well beyond the barn. She hesitated. It was farther than she had ever been allowed to go, but he only narrowed his eyes and tilted his head sharply. "Go," he said. She took the empty bucket and stepped out into the glaring heat. The ground beyond the barn felt different, the dust looser, the air thinner. She glanced back at the house. The man stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching, always watching. At the well, she tied the rope to the bucket, lowering it slowly. The pulley groaned, echoing across the empty yard. As she waited for the bucket to fill, she looked around. The barn doors were cracked open just enough to show darkness inside. A sudden rush of movement, a shape slipping between the shadows. Clara sucked in a breath, leaning forward. Was it an animal? Another person? Her heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced back toward the porch. The man hadn't moved. She pulled the bucket up, the water sloshing and shimmering in the sun. But her hand slipped on the wet handle, and it crashed to the ground, spilling the water into the dirt. She froze. For a moment, the world seemed to stop with her. Then the man's shout tore across the yard. "Clara!" She turned, her legs locked in place. He strode toward her, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust. She dropped to her knees, gathering the empty bucket, her breath ragged. When he reached her, he grabbed her wrist so hard she cried out. He yanked her up, his face close, eyes black with anger. "What did I say about mistakes?" he hissed. His breath was sour, heavy. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice breaking. He dragged her back toward the house, her feet stumbling over the rough ground. The bucket clanged behind them like a bell of warning. Inside, he shoved her against the wall. Her shoulder struck the wood with a crack, pain bursting down her arm. "You are here to work, to obey," he said, each word slow and deliberate, as if carving them into her. "There are no accidents. There are no second chances." Clara pressed her forehead against the wall, her tears mixing with sweat. She tried to swallow her sobs, but they slipped out in sharp, broken gasps. He stood behind her for a long moment, breathing heavily. Then he stepped back, the floor creaking beneath his weight. "Clean yourself," he ordered. "Then finish the water." She slid to the floor as he left, her body shaking. Outside, the sun slipped lower, casting long, crooked shadows through the window. Clara wiped her face with trembling hands, forcing herself upright. She picked up the bucket again, the handle biting into her raw fingers. As she stepped back outside, she dared one quick glance toward the barn. The shape in the shadows was gone. But in that single glance, something else sparked. A small, thin line of defiance, buried under her fear. A line she didn't dare touch yet. Not yet. The night fell heavy and silent, pressing against the thin walls like a wet cloth. Clara lay curled on her cot, her arms wrapped around her stomach, each breath sharp and shallow. The bruises on her shoulder and wrist throbbed in the darkness, a dull echo of the man's grip. She tried to keep her mind blank, to count the cracks in the ceiling, to imagine her mother's voice humming in the kitchen back home. But her thoughts kept crawling back to the barn, to that sudden shape moving in the shadows. When the moon rose high, she pushed the blanket aside and sat up slowly. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might wake the whole house. She moved to the window, careful not to let the old floorboards creak. Outside, the yard glowed pale under the moonlight. The barn doors stood ajar, just as she'd seen earlier. Her fingers trembled on the windowsill. She pressed her forehead to the glass, her breath fogging a small circle. The gate beyond the barn was visible in the distance, a wooden arch chained shut, but still there, like a thin promise on the edge of her mind. Suddenly a sound from the hallway, The faintest brush of a boot against wood. She shrank back from the window, her spine flush against the wall. The door to her room stayed closed. After a long, suffocating minute, the sound faded. Her pulse screamed at her, "Now!" She slipped her feet into her worn shoes and moved to the door. Her hand hovered over the knob, shaking. She twisted it slowly. The latch clicked, louder than thunder in the silence. She froze, eyes wide, but nothing moved beyond the hallway. She stepped out. The hallway stretched ahead, moonlight leaking through the edges of the windows, pooling on the floor like spilled milk. Clara moved 1 foot at a time, her breath trapped in her chest. When she reached the front door, she pressed her ear to the wood. No sound from his room, no shuffling, no breathing. She slid the bolt open, wincing at every metallic scrape. The door gave way, a rush of cold air hitting her face. She slipped outside, pulling the door closed behind her. The yard felt different under her feet, the dust cool and soft in the moonlight. She crept past the stacked logs, her eyes locked on the barn. But before she could take another step, a heavy clank echoed from the porch. She spun around. He stood there, his silhouette blocking the doorway, his hat still on, his shoulders wide and immovable in the moonlight. For a moment, neither of them moved. The whole night seemed to hold its breath. Then his voice, low, slicing the air. "Where do you think you're going?" Clara staggered backward, her mouth opening, but no sound came out. He stepped forward, one boot after another, each step heavy as an iron bell. She turned and ran. Her feet slipped on the dry earth, hands grabbing at nothing. She reached the side of the barn, her shoulder crashing into the rough wood. She pushed off, scrambling toward the gate. Behind her, his boots thundered, closer now, each step pulling at her spine like a hook. She reached the gate and grabbed the chain, pulling desperately. The metal rattled and bit into her fingers, the links cold and unyielding. Before she could pull again, his hand clamped around her arm. She screamed, the sound tearing out of her throat into the night. He yanked her back, slamming her against the gatepost. The moonlight flickered across his face, sharp, furious, a beast unmasked. His other hand rose, striking her cheek hard enough to make stars burst behind her eyes. She sagged against the wood, her breath gone. He dragged her back across the yard, her feet scraping the dirt. When they reached the porch, he threw her forward. She hit the steps, her knees splitting open on the edge. "Inside," he growled, his voice more animal than human. Clara crawled forward, her palms leaving smears of blood on the wood. Behind her, the gate swung slightly in the breeze, the chain glinting in the moonlight. The door slammed shut behind them with a deep, echoing crack. She lay on the hallway floor, the taste of iron thick in her mouth. Above her he stood breathing hard, the hat shadowing his eyes. "Try that again," he whispered, "and I will bury you here myself." Then he turned and vanished into the dark, leaving her shivering on the boards, her tears mixing with dust and blood. And in that cold, stifling silence, the last ember of her strength curled deeper inside her, small, but not yet dead. The morning after felt endless. Clara's entire body throbbed with a deep, bruising ache. Her face burned where his hand had landed. Her knees were crusted with blood, and her wrists stung from where he'd dragged her. She stayed on the cot long after the first light crept under the door. For once, he didn't bark orders at dawn. The hallway outside stayed quiet, heavy with a waiting sort of silence. When she finally forced herself to stand, she moved like an old woman, every movement sharp and slow. She rinsed her face in the cracked basin, wincing as cold water ran over the split skin. The door swung open without warning. She jolted back, nearly knocking the basin from its stand. The man filled the doorway, hat still shadowing his face. He looked at her for a long, flat moment, then jerked his chin toward the hall. "Kitchen," he said. She obeyed without a word, eyes low, her hands clutched tight to keep from shaking. In the kitchen, the tin cup and bread waited again. She sat and tore at the crust, her jaw stiff and swollen. While she chewed, she heard a noise from outside, a faint scuffle like something being moved. Her eyes drifted to the window. There, across the yard, she saw the barn doors wide open. Inside, shadows shifted, quick and hesitant. Her breath caught. Someone, or something, moved among the tools and hay. The man followed her gaze, and his face darkened. He grabbed her chin hard, forcing her to look at him. "Eyes here," he snapped. Her head trembled in his grip. She swallowed hard and nodded. He released her roughly and stepped toward the door. Before he left, he looked back once more, his stare pinning her to the chair. "Finish, then you scrub the porch. No wandering, no questions." The door slammed. She listened to his heavy steps cross the yard, fading toward the barn. Clara rose, her legs weak, and shuffled to the window. She watched as he disappeared into the barn, the doors swallowing him whole. Minutes passed. She stood frozen, her nails digging into the windowsill. Then another movement. From the far side of the barn, a figure slipped out, the maid. Her gray dress almost vanished against the wall, her head bent low. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, hugging it to her chest as she darted along the side of the barn toward the well. Clara pressed her forehead to the glass, her pulse thudding in her temples. The maid paused at the well, glancing over her shoulder. She knelt quickly, hiding the bundle behind the stone wall, then ran back toward the barn before disappearing inside again. Clara's mouth went dry. What had she hidden? She backed away from the window, her breath ragged. The man returned some time later, slamming the barn doors shut with a sharp echo. He crossed the yard in long strides, his coat flaring behind him like a dark wing. Clara rushed to the porch and fell to her knees, scrubbing furiously. Her hands moved on their own, smearing dust and blood across the boards. He didn't speak to her as he passed. He didn't even glance her way. But in that moment, as the sun glared against her back and the pain burned through her palms, a single thought flashed in her mind, sharp and blinding. There is something here for me, a secret, a chance. And though her body trembled and her skin screamed, that thought kept her hand moving, kept her alive, kept her listening. The afternoon sun settled low, turning the yard into a flat, glaring sheet of white. Clara's eyes stung from the brightness, her back slick with sweat as she finished scrubbing the porch. Every movement sent jolts of pain up her arms, but she forced her body to obey. When she finally set the bucket aside, she crawled backward until her feet found solid ground. She leaned against the wall, her breath coming in sharp, shallow pulls. Inside, the house felt silent, but not empty. The man moved somewhere beyond the hallway, his boots echoing on the boards now and then. Clara's gaze drifted toward the well. The image of the maid hiding that small bundle played over and over in her mind. The thought of it tugged at her, a quiet pull beneath her ribs that she couldn't silence. As she sat there, the back door creaked open. The man stepped out, his silhouette blocking the doorway. He scanned the yard slowly, his eyes pausing on her for a long moment. Then he nodded toward the barn. "Barn," he said simply. Her fingers dug into the dirt as she forced herself to stand. She kept her head down and shuffled past him, her knees still raw and burning. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay, sweat, and old iron. Tools lined the walls, pitchforks, shovels, coiled rope. She felt their shapes pressing at her from every side. He followed her in, closing the doors behind them with a heavy, final thud. "Clean," he ordered, gesturing at a pile of straw scattered across the floor. She bent at once, gathering the straw with shaking hands. As she worked, he circled the space slowly, his boots scraping the ground. He picked up a rope, coiling it idly in his hands as he watched her. Every time she moved, she felt the rope in his grip. Each flick of his fingers against the fibers sounded like a whip in her mind. She pushed the straw into a corner, her breath growing ragged. Her hands trembled so badly she dropped some, scattering it across the floor again. "Clumsy," he murmured. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat had closed around every possible word. Suddenly, he stepped forward and dropped the coiled rope beside her feet. The sound made her flinch violently. "Stand," he commanded. Clara rose slowly, swaying, her vision blurred at the edges. He moved closer, his face inches from hers now. She smelled sweat, dust, something sour beneath it all. His eyes stayed fixed on her, dark and unblinking. "You think you can run?" he asked, voice low, a quiet snarl buried under each syllable. She shook her head frantically, tears slipping free before she could stop them. His hand shot out, grabbing her chin, forcing her to look up. "You belong here," he said. "There is nothing else for you." Her chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. He released her, stepping back. His expression shifted, not softer, only colder, as if he'd lost interest in a broken toy. "Finish!" he ordered, turning away. Clara dropped to her knees, gathering the last handfuls of straw. Each piece felt sharp against her skin, each breath a silent scream. When he left the barn, the heavy doors groaned and shut with a deep echo, trapping her in the half-light. She stayed still for a long time, her forehead pressed to the dirt. The rope lay beside her, a silent threat and a reminder. In that quiet, she remembered the bundle at the well. A single spark, faint but alive, whispered to her again, "There is still a way." She forced her hands to keep moving, stacking the straw neatly, her mind clutching that thought like a last thread in the dark. When Clara finally stepped out of the barn, the sky had begun to dim, sinking into a gray-blue hush. Her body moved as if it no longer belonged to her, arms heavy, knees raw and pulsing with each step. She glanced quickly toward the porch. The man sat in a wooden chair, his hat tilted low, a faint curl of smoke rising from a thin cigar pinched between his fingers. He didn't look at her, but she knew he saw everything. She turned away before her eyes could betray her, and moved toward the pump, splashing her hands and face in the cold water. The sting in her cuts jolted her mind awake. She sucked in a sharp breath, gripping the edge of the basin. Through the corner of her eye, she saw the barn doors again, and beyond them, the well. The bundle! She wiped her face, dried her hands on her skirt, and turned back. The man remained on the porch, unmoving, the cigar glowing like an orange eye in the dusk. She forced herself to walk slowly, as if gathering stray tools. Each step sent her heart slamming against her ribs. She passed the barn's side wall, her fingers grazing the rough boards. At the well she knelt, eyes darting back to the porch. Still no movement. With shaking hands, she reached behind the stone wall. Her fingers closed around the cloth bundle. She pulled it free, her breath catching as she loosened the knot. Inside, she found a small, tattered notebook. Its cover was soft from wear, the edges frayed. Beneath it, a thin strip of ribbon, pale pink, smudged with dirt. Her hands trembled as she flipped the pages open. Words scribbled in a tight, rushed hand. "He watches always, the barn at night, the attic, I heard cries. No one leaves, the gate is chained. He lies." Another page. "If you find this, remember me, remember Sarah. I tried to go. Please, finish what I could not." Clara's mouth went dry. Sarah, a name, Proof. She pressed her forehead to the well-stones, her tears dripping onto the page, smudging the ink into blurry rivers. The pink ribbon slipped from her fingers and fell into the dust. She closed the notebook and stuffed it inside her dress, close against her skin. The rough paper felt like a heartbeat against her ribs. Behind her, a sudden creak of wood. She jerked upright. The man had stood from his chair, his head tilted slightly as if sniffing the air. She snatched the ribbon from the ground, clutched it tight, and pushed herself up. She forced her feet into a steady, slow walk, moving toward the pump again. When she looked back, he had turned away, stepping inside the house. Clara exhaled so hard her knees nearly buckled. She dropped the ribbon into her apron pocket, her fingers wrapping around it like a prayer. In that single moment, the secrets she carried felt heavier than her entire body. But in the dark weight, a shape began to form, a path, thin as a hairline crack in a glass pane. She turned to the fading sky, her fists clenched, and felt the ember inside her spark hotter than ever before. That night, the house swallowed every sound. Clara lay stiff on her cot, the notebook pressed to her chest beneath her thin blanket. She felt its edges dig into her skin with each shallow breath, a painful but grounding weight. She replayed the words again and again. Sarah, the attic, no one leaves, he lies. The name circled her mind like a trapped bird. She pictured Sarah's face, though she had never seen it, imagined her hands scribbling those words in the dark, her last desperate act before she vanished. Sometime after midnight, the floorboards above her creaked. Clara's eyes snapped open. She held her breath. A faint thump followed, then a dragging sound. The attic. She slid from the cot, her bare feet landing on the cold floor with barely a sound. She crouched, waiting, straining to hear. The noises continued, uneven, as though someone moved slowly, unwillingly. Clara's fingers closed around the edge of her blanket. She stood, inching toward the door. Her hand hovered over the knob. She glanced toward the hallway crack, her breath trembling in her throat. The thin moonlight slashed across the floorboards, catching on the nail that still held the scrap of cloth from before. She turned the knob slowly. The hallway beyond sat empty and dark. Clara stepped out, her toes gripping the wood. She tiptoed down the hall, each step echoing in her skull. She paused at the staircase leading up. The first step moaned under her weight, the sound stretching into the silence like a scream. She froze, heart hammering. No movement from the rooms below. Another step, then another. She forced her body up, her hands sliding along the cracked banister. At the attic door, she stopped. A rusty hook latch barely held it shut. Her fingers hovered over it, trembling. She could almost feel Sarah's ghost urging her forward. She unhooked it. The door swung inward with a sigh, releasing a wave of musty, heavy air. Inside, the attic felt alive with shadows. Piles of crates and old blankets formed strange shapes in the moonlight, leaking through a small broken window. She stepped inside, ducking under a beam. A sudden movement in the corner caught her eye. A shape, low and curled up. Clara's breath stuck in her throat. She took another step closer. There, huddled in the shadows, was a small figure. A girl, her hair matted, her dress in tatters. She rocked back and forth, her thin arms wrapped around her knees. Clara dropped to her knees beside her, reaching out. The girl flinched violently, her eyes wide and wild, the whites bright in the dark. Clara drew her hand back, her voice coming out a thin, broken whisper. "Sarah?" The girl's head twitched, her lips parted, but no sound came out. Tears tracked down her dirty cheeks. Clara's heart twisted. She looked at the girl's wrists, raw and bruised. Clara wanted to speak, to promise help, but no words felt strong enough. Instead, she reached slowly into her dress, pulling out the pink ribbon. She offered it. The girl stared, trembling, then snatched it, clutching it to her chest with a feral desperation. A soft rustling below snapped Clara's attention. Footsteps, heavy, measured, rising from the first floor. Her blood turned to ice. She looked back at the girl, their eyes locking in a silent, shared terror. Clara grabbed her hand. "We have to go," she mouthed. The girl hesitated, then squeezed Clara's fingers in a weak, terrified grip. Clara pulled her gently toward the door, her own heart roaring in her ears. Below, a board creaked louder. The attic swallowed them again, but in that darkness, Clara felt the first fragile thread of something beyond fear, the first hint of rebellion. Together, they slipped toward the stairs, two shadows stitched to the same breath, holding tight to the single chance that had finally begun to open. They crept down the attic stairs like ghosts, each step trembling under their feet. Clara felt Sarah's fragile hand in hers, the girl's fingers twitching with every distant sound from below. At the landing, Clara paused, straining to hear. The hallway lay silent, the door to the man's room cracked open just a hair. A thin sliver of lamplight sliced across the floorboards like a blade. Clara glanced at Sarah. The girl's eyes darted wildly, her breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Clara pressed a finger to her own lips. "Wait! Listen!" Suddenly, a faint creak behind them. Clara jerked her head around. The maid stood at the far end of the hallway, her gray dress melting into the shadows. In her trembling hands, she held a small iron key. Their eyes locked. The maid's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, as if trying to form a word she hadn't spoken in years. Finally, in a voice so thin it nearly broke, she whispered, "Gate, tonight, run." She lifted the key, her hand shaking violently. Clara hesitated only a heartbeat before moving forward. The maid met her halfway, pressing the key into her palm. Clara felt the cold metal bite into her skin, real, solid, terrifying. The maid's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She leaned close, her breath a thin thread on Clara's cheek. "Go!" she hissed. "Don't look back." Before Clara could answer, the maid turned and disappeared down the narrow side hallway, her gray shape swallowed by the dark. Clara clutched the key so hard her knuckles turned white. She turned to Sarah, who stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing in soundless terror. Clara squeezed her shoulder, urging her forward. They moved past the man's door, each step a prayer. The sliver of lamplight shifted once. A chair creaked inside the room, but no footsteps followed. At the back door, Clara fumbled with the key, her fingers slick with sweat. The lock groaned as she turned it, the noise splitting the silence like a gunshot. Sarah whimpered, her hand digging into Clara's arm. Clara shushed her quickly, her own breath shaking. Finally, the latch clicked. She pushed the door open just enough for them to slip through. Outside, the air hit them like a slap, sharp, dry, alive with cicadas and the distant murmur of wind through the dead grass. The moon hung low and heavy, throwing silver shadows across the yard. Clara pointed toward the barn, then to the gate beyond it. Sarah nodded once, her eyes wide, her legs ready to collapse beneath her. They bolted. Their feet barely touched the ground as they sprinted past the barn. The air seemed to suck every sound from around them. No barking dogs, no shouted warnings, only the frantic thud of their own hearts. Clara risked one glance back. The house stood silent, dark except for that one thin slice of light. No figure in the doorway, no boots pounding after them. At the gate, Clara shoved the key into the heavy lock, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. The chain rattled, the metal teeth catching. Sarah clutched Clara's arm, whimpering with each breath. Clara gritted her teeth and twisted the key hard. A loud final click. She yanked the chain free and threw it aside. The gate swung open with a long, low groan that echoed across the yard. She grabbed Sarah's hand again, and together they stepped beyond the fence line. For the first time, Clara felt the air shift around them, wild, open, unchained. She didn't dare believe they were free yet, but as they ran into the night, the key still warm in her fist, Clara felt something deep inside her chest break loose and surge forward. A thin, fierce blade of hope, sharp enough to cut through every silent threat that still might come. The dirt path beyond the gate felt like another world, dry and uneven, littered with stones that cut into Clara's feet with each hurried step. She held Sarah's hand tightly, afraid to let go even for a second. The girl stumbled often, her breath hitching in broken sobs, but she didn't stop. The moon guided them in pieces, slicing the path into patches of silver and deep black. In the far distance, a low ridge marked the edge of the property. Beyond that, Clara didn't know what waited, but it had to be better than the house, than the attic, than him. Sarah collapsed once, falling to her knees. Clara pulled her up quickly, whispering, "You can't stop now." "We're almost there. Almost." The girl's eyes were wide and lost, but she nodded, forcing her legs to move. Behind them the house loomed, a dark shape pressed against the horizon. Clara imagined him discovering the empty hallway, the open gate. She imagined his boots slamming onto the porch, the howl of rage tearing from his throat. They reached a small dry gully at the edge of the yard, half choked with brittle weeds and sharp rocks. Clara pulled Sarah down into it, crouching low. The air around them trembled with insects and the faint rustle of wind through dead grass. She pressed Sarah close, her own heart slamming against her ribs like a fist. "We wait here for a moment," Clara whispered. "Catch your breath." Sarah clutched the pink ribbon to her chest, her thin shoulders shaking. In the moonlight, the ribbon looked like a strip of pale flame, a tiny talisman of all that had been stolen, and all that could still be saved. Clara forced her mind to calm, to think. They would need water, food, a direction. But none of that mattered yet. First, they had to disappear beyond the fence line, beyond his reach. A sudden crack echoed across the yard, a door slamming open. Clara's head jerked up. She strained to see, her eyes catching a small glow, a lantern swinging in the darkness, moving along the porch. He was coming! She grabbed Sarah's hand again. "Now! We go now!" They scrambled up the gully's far side, dirt sliding under their feet. Clara's nails tore as she clawed at rocks and weeds, hauling Sarah behind her. The cold air sliced her lungs, but she kept moving, her mind a single pulsing command. Run! 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 When they reached the crest of the ridge, Clara risked one look back. The lantern light swung violently now, cutting wild circles through the yard. His shadow loomed behind it, long, monstrous, hungry. She turned away, pulling Sarah over the ridge. Ahead, the land spread wide and black under the moon, a thin animal trail snaking through dry grass toward a distant tree line. The smell of open earth hit her nose, sharp, wild, terrifying, and beautiful. Clara felt something crack inside her, a soundless scream that turned into a flood of raw, hot courage. She squeezed Sarah's hand once, hard. "Don't let go," she gasped. And together they plunged forward into the open dark, the key and the ribbon pressed to their chests like tiny, defiant flames. They tore through the scrubby grass, each step a gamble against the darkness. Clara led, her hand welded to Sarah's, her lungs burning with every ragged breath. The dry earth shifted under their feet, small stones cutting their soles, but neither dared slow down. Behind them, a shout split the night, raw, furious, echoing across the open fields like a gunshot. Clara didn't look back. She could hear him crashing through the yard, hear the lantern smash against the porch. Then the pounding of boots, heavy and furious, following the trail through the open gate. Sarah stumbled again, nearly dragging Clara down with her. Clara gripped her tighter, pulling her up so hard Sarah whimpered in pain. "Don't stop," Clara gasped. "We're so close. Just a little farther." The land sloped upward, the trail thinning as they climbed toward the low stand of trees ahead. Every muscle in Clara's body screamed, her vision dancing at the edges with black spots. A second shout. Closer now. Clara felt the echo shake her spine. She pushed Sarah ahead, half dragging, half carrying her up the last stretch. The girl's breath rattled in her throat, her legs moving more out of fear than strength. As they crested the rise, the ground fell away into a small hollow, dense with wild brush and tangled roots. Clara scanned quickly. A fallen tree lay across a narrow dip in the ground, a dark pocket just large enough to hide them. She pointed, nearly sobbing. "There! Go!" Sarah stumbled toward the fallen tree, collapsing under its twisted limbs. Clara threw herself down beside her, pulling branches and dry grass over them, hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the brittle stalks. They lay still, pressed together, their hearts beating like twin war drums. Clara clamped her hand over Sarah's mouth, feeling the girl's hot breath against her palm. Moments later, heavy steps thudded at the top of the ridge. Clara's entire body seized. She didn't dare breathe. Above them, he stood outlined in moonlight, broad-shouldered, hat low, his shape like some cruel statue carved from the night itself. He turned slowly, scanning the land below. "Clara!" he roared, his voice tearing the darkness into shreds. The sound hit her like a blade. She pressed herself lower, her face buried in Sarah's hair. The girl trembled so violently, Clara feared she might scream. He took a step forward, then another, the ground crackling beneath his boots. Clara's nails dug into the dirt, her pulse thundering in her ears. The key in her pocket felt like a burning coal against her hip. Then silence. For a long, crushing moment, he stood still, head tilted as if listening to the earth itself. Clara felt her stomach twist into knots. Finally he turned. With a sharp animal sound, part growl, part snarl, he stomped back up the ridge, his figure shrinking as he disappeared over the rise. Clara didn't move. She counted each heartbeat, waiting for his return. Minutes bled into each other, her muscles locking in place. Only when the cicadas slowly returned, their thin song filling the night air again, did she dare let go of Sarah's mouth. The girl gulped air, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. Clara hugged her close, burying her face in the girl's hair. "We're alive," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "We're alive." Above them, the stars burned cold and distant. But in that tiny hollow, buried beneath roots and dust, they clung to each other. Two trembling shadows bound by terror and a single shared will to keep moving. And somewhere beyond the darkness the path waited, narrow, unknown, but finally open. They stayed hidden until the moon began to dip low, the first hint of gray brushing the eastern sky. Every sound in the hollow felt magnified. The rustle of a beetle in the grass, the sharp crack of a twig in the breeze, their own uneven breaths. Clara's body ached from lying twisted under the branches. Her arms cramped around Sarah's shivering frame, her skin raw where thorns and grit had cut into her. But she did not loosen her grip. When the first pale light touched the ridge above them, Clara knew it was time. She shifted carefully, her joints stiff as old wood. Sarah whimpered, her face pale and streaked with dried tears, but she nodded weakly when Clara met her eyes. "We have to move," Clara whispered, her lips brushing the girl's forehead. "Now, before he circles back." They crawled out from under the fallen tree, brushing dirt and dry leaves from their clothes. Clara straightened, scanning the ridge. No sound, no dark silhouette against the morning sky. She reached down, helping Sarah to her feet. The girl staggered but stayed upright, her small fingers locking around Clara's wrist. Together, they stepped into the brush beyond the hollow. Each footfall felt like stepping off a ledge, a silent dare to the world to stop them. The first rays of sun broke over the far hills, painting the ground in cold silver and pale gold. The open land before them looked endless. Patches of dry grass, scraggly shrubs, the faint shimmer of a far-off creek. Clara pointed toward the creek. "Water," she breathed. "We go there first." Sarah nodded, clutching the pink ribbon to her chest. Clara could see her lips moving, silent prayers, or maybe just a chant to keep her mind from splintering. They started forward, every muscle in Clara's body tight and ready to bolt at the first sound of pursuit. But the world around them remained hushed, holding its breath as if it too watched their desperate escape. At one point Clara glanced back. The ridge behind them sat empty, the house beyond now a smudge against the brightening sky. For the first time, the place looked small, shrinking, a dying husk instead of a towering monster. They reached the creek as the sun rose higher, the water sluggish but clear enough to drink. Clara dropped to her knees, scooping handfuls to her mouth. The taste of cold water cut through the dust in her throat, sending a sharp ache through her teeth. Sarah fell beside her, gulping clumsily, her small hands shaking so hard she splashed most of it on her face and dress. Clara grabbed her wrist, steadying her. "Slowly," she murmured, her own voice hoarse and thin. When they had both drunk their fill, Clara sat back, staring at the water's slow ripple. She felt the weight of the key in her pocket, the notebook pressed against her ribs. Proof of what had been done. Proof of the girl beside her. She touched Sarah's hair gently, brushing twigs away. The girl leaned into her hand, her eyes closing for a moment. The first sign of trust Clara had seen in her. "We keep going," Clara whispered. "Beyond these fields. Find people, find help. He won't touch us again." Sarah's fingers tightened around the ribbon, her lips parting in a small, silent breath. A breeze stirred across the creek, lifting dust and carrying it away. Clara felt it slide over her skin, cool and alive, different from the heavy, suffocating air of the ranch. She looked up at the brightening sky, her eyes burning from exhaustion and salt. They had not won yet, but they had ruptured the boundary, broken through the first circle of his control. And as she stood, helping Sarah to her feet again, Clara felt a surge of something she hadn't let herself feel in so long. A raw, trembling pulse of freedom. They turned toward the distant tree line, their steps slow but certain, each one cracking the old chains a little more. They moved slowly now, the early morning sun climbing higher, turning the fields into a pale sea of gold and gray. Each step felt heavy, as if the earth itself clung to their feet, but neither of them dared stop. Clara led, glancing back at Sarah every few moments, her mind a constant hum of questions. How far is the nearest town? Will someone help us? Will he find us before we get there? Sarah stumbled often, her thin legs shaking, but she never let go of Clara's hand. The pink ribbon hung from her fist like a fragile flag, the only splash of softness against the dust-streaked world. By midday, they reached the edge of a small grove of twisted mesquite trees. Clara pulled Sarah into the shade, easing her down onto a patch of brittle grass. They shared the last of the water from the creek, the metal cup trembling in Clara's hand as she lifted it to the girl's lips. When Sarah finished, she sagged against Clara's side, her breathing ragged but steady. Clara wrapped an arm around her shoulders, staring out through the gaps in the trees toward the open fields beyond. Somewhere behind them, the ranch still squatted under the sun, empty halls echoing with silence and rage. Clara imagined him there, pacing the yard, his boots digging angry furrows in the dirt. She could almost hear the slam of doors, the curses spat into the wind. But he was far now, and every mile they put between themselves and that place loosened the knot around her heart. Sarah shifted, her head pressing into Clara's ribs. Clara looked down and met the girl's gaze, eyes no longer completely hollow, but still glassy with fear. Clara touched the pink ribbon lightly, feeling its rough edges against her fingers. "You did it," she whispered. "You held on." Sarah's lips parted, and for a moment Clara thought she might speak. Instead, she only pressed the ribbon tighter to her chest, her chin dipping in a tiny, trembling nod. The afternoon stretched on, the heat rising in waves from the ground. Clara knew they had to keep moving, but for that one small hour they stayed under the trees. She listened to Sarah's breathing slow, felt the girl's small frame relax by degrees. When Clara finally rose, she did it carefully, guiding Sarah to her feet. The girl swayed but stood, leaning heavily on Clara's arm. They stepped out from the grove together. The horizon shimmered in the distance, a thin blue line where the land met sky, hinting at water, at a road, at the faint chance of other lives. Clara set her eyes on it. She tightened her grip on Sarah's hand, felt the warmth of it, the fragile pulse that told her they were still here, still fighting. As they took their first steps beyond the grove, Clara felt the final threads of the old life snap away. Each footfall was an ache, each breath a wound, but each was also a vow. We will not go back. Behind them, the sun carved long, sharp shadows across the dirt, two thin shapes moving forward into the blinding open light. They didn't speak, they didn't look back, and though the price had carved deep into their bones, they walked forward. Two survivors, stitched together by pain, by defiance, and by the fragile, burning ember of freedom that at last refused to die.